Hello everybody and welcome to this lecture today from a very hot day here in Schleining, Austria. My name is Julia Scharinger and I, as always, have the pleasure of moderating this lecture and welcoming all of you here with us. With us today is also Dr Siad Darwish from CDA, the Collaborative Learning Project in Australia. Siad holds a PhD in anthropology from Rutgers University and is not only an anthropologist but also a peace builder specialized in gender and environmental peace and conflict. He actually just published a very interesting read on inclusion of masculinities into peace building practice with conciliation resources, which I can highly recommend. Today, however, Siad will be talking to us more from the lens of environmental peace building. So thank you for joining us, Siad, and it's a real pleasure spending this time with you. For those who were with us in the last lecture, you may remember that Dr. Julia Sugandi from UNDP in Indonesia took us already into some aspects of the socio-ecological crisis we currently face, into its complexity, into grassroots innovations, then towards a sense or a possibility of planetary justice. Now Siad will invite us to reflect on this further and also takes us a bit more into the age of the Anthropocene by expanding belonging or ideas and experiences of belonging beyond humans and towards the environment. He will do so through sharing and analyzing two stories with us, so you'll also get a chance to experience how stories can be used very, very purposefully. And in our preparation, Siad shared that he likes to be interrupted, so this too will be a very interactive session. So please adjust your camera accordingly, because we will also record Siad's input and put them on YouTube. Now, before handing over to you, Siad, I'd like to share the following, or how I got to know about Siad in the beginning, and it was through a blog post where he took us to Syria, and he wrote about the radical ethics of belonging, or the localized ethics of belonging, which really resonated and inspired my curiosity. He also shared in the preparation today that he will work from a practice of ethics of care, and that very much resonates with us here at the ASPR and in this overall series. And as many of you know, especially those who've been with us for a few lectures by now, this series is part of the ASPR's campaign on Terre Patrie, Homeland Earth, which, amongst other things, really strives to practice ways of engagement and connection that are rooted in an ethics of care, of kindness, curiosity, reflexivity. And we really appreciate you keeping this close and throughout this lecture, or taking it forward throughout this lecture and beyond. And with that, thanks for joining us today. Thank you especially, Siad, and welcome. And I wish all of us a meaningful time and conversation ahead.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you to ASPR for inviting me. And thanks to the wide geographical spread we got. If the Excel sheet that I saw of participants is anything to go about, we have a very broad geographical spread, and that's wonderful, and particularly wonderful for this topic. So welcome, and thank you for spending some time with me here. As Julia has said, interrupt me. I don't want to listen to my own voice the whole time. Interrupt me at any point. But I'll try to tell you a couple of stories, and I'll tell you why I will tell you those stories. But on the whole, I really hope that we can interact and actually explore some of these questions. These are burning questions at the center of environmental peace building, but I'll get to them in a different sort of way. And I'll share my screen with you now. So welcome. I was invited to give this talk based on a piece I wrote on Syria, and the piece was really about localization originally. And localization, as you know, is a sort of very technical project in international aid to primarily relocate funds from global institutions to more local institutions. But it is also very much about power and liberation from colonial bonds. It is seen by many as a decolonial project, shaking off the colonial history that the development industry has. And in that piece, I really looked at what the Syrian population did during the war. And in the early days of the war, when the authoritarian state retreated, what they did is they started to organize themselves across the board in localized councils. So a kind of homegrown version of localization that I looked at. And looking at that experience and drawing on some anthropologists and feminists, I basically made an argument that localization isn't exactly about space. Locus meaning space in Greek. But that localization is really about encounters between humans, and particularly an ethical encounter. And I don't mean by ethics or morals here a set of rules that are written down, but really being good to each other and what emerges from that in an encounter. So locality emerges through this ethics of people working together and trying to build something that is good together. And it's emergent. And really labor, ritual, humanitarian aid, and particularly all forms of care can create this idea of the local. And it can therefore create this idea of the local outside of space, because you can work with and care for people outside of your direct space. But as Julia said in her introduction, I'm both an environmental anthropologist and an environmental peace builder. And particularly in the context of this lecture series and the work of Edgar Morin on Homeland Earth, I want to explore what this idea of the ethical as an encounter between humans means for the relationship between humans and non-humans, humans and animals, humans and plants, humans and the climate in the 21st century. And I will do that in sort of a roundabout way. And if you allow me, I'd like to explore this question of non-locality or locality that's outside of a space, really through some of the spaces and cultural spaces I've lived in. And some of the ones that you've lived in, because some of you have sent me responses to my questions that I sent out initially. And these responses were very insightful. So I'd love to discuss them right after I share some stories with you. So if you allow me, I start with a poem of shared human and plant exile that was written in the 8th century Spain. The poem goes as follows. In the midst of my garden grows a palm tree, born in the West, away from the country of palm trees. I cried, you are like me, for you resemble me in wandering and peregrination, and the long separation from kith and kin. You also grew up on a foreign soil. Like me, you are far from the country of your birth. May the fertilizing clouds of morning water you in exile. May the beneficent rains be sought by the poor never forsake you. This is a very famous poem that really most people that know the Arab language will know. And it was written in the 8th century, as I said, about in the 770s probably, by Abd-Rahman al-Dakhil. Abd-Rahman al-Dakhil was the very last of the Umayyad dynasty, and the Umayyad dynasty was the first of the Islamic dynasties. So a kingdom based around Islam, an empire based around Islam, that was based out of Damascus in the 8th century. The rule of the Umayyad finished with regicide, the killing of kings. The Abbasids from Baghdad came over and did what happened in the Russian Revolution, killed the royal family completely. And the last one that was left was Abd-Rahman. He left his family behind and lost his family, and in a famous story with his brother, swam through the Euphrates as they're running away, and his brother gets killed, and he then keeps on running and eventually makes his way all the way from Syria, where his dynasty and his caliphate ends, and finds himself in Spain, in this incredibly 8th century, Middle Ages of Spain, incredibly diverse society with Christians and Jews and traders from North Africa and African slaves. And so he comes there and manages to establish a separate caliphate, a very small, separate entity. And according to many historians, he managed to build one of the most inclusive and prosperous societies in the history of the world there, in which Christian, Jews, and Muslims in particular lived together and worked together to build a new kind of society. If you're interested, you can find a story, his story, and the story of Andalusia at the time, in a book called The Ornament of the World: How Muslim, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. This, once again, it links to our idea of tolerance and peace building. I would argue in part that he could encounter a palm tree in exile through the humbleness that comes from exile, through the tragedy that comes from exile. He encountered a palm tree that was a plant that he recognized from home as his equal because he was displaced. And this tragedy of displacement, the tragedy of losing his family, allowed him to meet nature or the environment in a different sort of way. This is, of course, conjecture, but there's certainly a connection between trying to be tolerant and trying to build a world that is inclusive, and this experience of nature and what nature is in that world, or the environment as we would call it today. So it's really this idea of tragedy, I think, that I want to hold on to, or this idea of catastrophe, because this is what we are concerned with increasingly in environmental peace building. And catastrophe, on a very personal basis, is where this story of al-Rahman connects to another story that's a little bit closer to home. In February 1985, Val Plum would paddle down one of the countless rivers in Australia's magnificent tropical Kakadu National Park in a one-person canoe. Famously, you should not paddle down in a canoe in these kind of places. We know that today. It was raining heavily and starting to rain harder. Val Plum would, however, a philosopher, famous environmentalist and feminist, was an experienced bushwalker. A bushwalker is somebody, a wanderer, somebody who's very good at hiking and knows the bush, the natural environment of Australia, well. She had received maps of a hiking trail from a ranger that she was seeking out. But at some point, the rain became too hard even for her, and she turned back to the ranger station. While paddling back, a stick, or what seemed to have been a stick, caught her eye. The stick rose out of the water and started to batter her canoe with its long, scaly tail. She tried to jump into a tree to escape her predator, but a crocodile jumped after her and pulled her into a death roll, the action by which crocodiles kill their prey. Allow me to read from Val Plumwood's own reflection on that moment that she wrote decades later. She wrote a quick piece right afterwards, but she only really reflected on it decades later, I think in part because it was a very traumatic experience. And these are her words, I quote, "At the moment of being grabbed by those powerful jaws, there was something profoundly and incredibly wrong in what was happening, some sort of mistaken identity. My disbelief was not just existential, but ethical. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. The world was not like that. The creature was breaking the rules, was totally mistaken, utterly wrong to think I could be reduced to food. As a human being, I was so much more than food. It was a denial of, an insult to all I was to reduce me to food. Were all the other facets of my being to be sacrificed to this utterly undiscriminating use? Was my complex organization to be destroyed so I could be reassembled as part of this other being? With indignation as well as disbelief, I rejected this event. It was an illusion. It was not only unjust, but unreal. It couldn't be happening. After much later reflection, I came to see that there was another way to look at it. There was an illusion, all right, but it was the other way around. It was the world of normal experience that was the illusion. And the newly disclosed brute world in which I was prey was, in fact, the unexpected reality or at least a crucial part of it. The illusion revealed by the crocodile encounter revealed that it was possible for people, as individuals, groups, perhaps whole cultures that subscribe to a particular dominant story, to be completely and systematically wrong about quite simple and basic things. Our relationship to food, to one another, the intertwining of life and death, the flashy, embodied character of human existence, and be quite unaware of it. End quote. Plum would survive this encounter by pressing her thumbs in the crocodile's eyes and dragging herself mangled back to the ranger station. She only died in 2008, years later. Crocodile predation on humans, not unlike cyclones or wildfires, or if you want, epidemics, have the unique ability to recall to us something uncomfortable about who we are. It reminds us that we are part of nature and that therefore we were never masters of it. Val Plum, today one of the most revered ecofeminist writers and one of Australia's great environmentalists, went on to show that this false dualism, man and nature, has been used not only to dominate and destroy natural environments, but to oppress those that are considered closer to nature, women, indigenous people, the disabled. She went on to show that this false dichotomy between us and the natural world was in fact at the basis of a lot of discrimination in society, and particularly discrimination against women. This false ontology of separation created difference where there was none, both amongst humans and between humans and our environments. These two stories of tragedy that created or contributed to the ethical formation of two beings, al-Rahman and Val Plum, are extreme encounters with the environment, you might say. They are really outstanding. Exile and regicide, and a human being turned into prey never happens. But increasingly, these extreme encounters with nature are the norm. We are finding ourselves in the midst of a pandemic that radically transformed the way we organize our societies. We're sitting here in front of screens talking to each other, where I've just been talking to people somewhere else in the world, in Sydney, that there's an outbreak that just started, and you look in the street and masks are up. Tragedy, this particular tragedy, many of us realize that our bodies are porous, that they exchange fluids, minerals, but also bacteria and viruses with our environment. And the evidence suggests that that virus jumped the species boundary exactly because of the way we mistreated other species, the way we draw boundaries between us and them. I took this picture that you see here, and if you go to the very left end of the picture, just above the waterline, and walk another 200 meters, you'll find the house of my family. This is during the Australian bushfires of 2019-2020. So last year, our house was nearly burnt down in the largest wildfires in the history of the state of New South Wales, notably a place that has wildfires all the time. As an interesting side note, Val Plumwood's house, which is probably about 200 or 300 kilometers away from the house where I live, in the bush also, survived. The whole of the area was engulfed in flame, and most people where her house was lost their buildings. But her building actually survived, and it survived in part because she had built a natural plant garden around her house, and these natural plants somehow protected it. But that's just on a side note. Stories of predation and reversal, or regicide, the killing of kings, and exile don't seem that extreme in this context. We're living already in an extremely extreme context all the time, surrounded by fires, surrounded by floods and by cyclones and epidemics. I've not been eaten by a crocodile, but my house was nearly eaten by fire. I'm not an exile from my home, but COVID has made me a temporary exile here in Australia, where I've been locked in for 1.5 years now. I know many of you across the world have similar stories, stories that tragedy is a big word, but stories that are tragic. During the fires here, and in moments of tragedy, what I could observe, certainly here in these moments of extreme encounters, is that people grew closer together, that conservation moved into the foreground in the public discourse in Australia. The fires really moved people in ways that through this intense encounter with nature, in ways that the everyday life doesn't. My point is, extreme encounters with the environment are becoming the norm across the world. They offer an opportunity to transform relationships with one another and with our environments. Our emergent ethics from these encounters will shape the way we will live and survive. As your responses to my questions that I sent out via email have shown, our relationship to the natural world changes over time. There's a very, very clear pattern. So these beautiful stories that you sent me, thank you, from all over the world, have a very clear pattern in which the grandparents generally were working the land, and slowly there is a movement away from the land, a utilitarian relationship maybe to the land, but most of us in the end have become city dwellers and are quite removed from it. So the relationship to the environment has been changing through even 3 generations. And in this roundabout way, I'll get to you to questions of environmental peace building. Because some of the questions that we're asking in environmental peace building is exactly, how can we create social cohesion? How can we bring people together over extreme environmental events? Because increasingly they are becoming the norm, and because a lot of data seems to tell us that possibly these intense environmental events will in fact pull people apart. The evidence goes both ways, but really we have to think strongly about our place in nature and in an increasingly extreme environment, and what that means to our relationship to each other. And so a very technical question then here is, but one that concerns us as environmental peace builders, is how can we build socio-natural relations, connections between environment and society? Remember the dualism that Plum talked about, get rid of it again. And what would it mean for us to think about us as part of nature and us as part of society, and think about how can we build not just more solid and more resilient societies to conflict and so on, but more resilient socio-natural relations, where environments and humans are resilient to both social and environmental shocks. This is really one of the core questions at the center of environmental peace building. And then what really I'm interested in is, what is the kind of ethical behavior, the kind of encounters that must underlie those relationships. And these encounters we have them every day, encounters with nature. They don't have to be extreme. It's just that the extreme ones do something very specific. But you have them with your pet, you have them with your houseplant. You certainly have them when you walk in nature. So that's where I end, and where I would open up some of those questions and some of the beautiful reflections also that you send me about how, how relationships to nature have changed, or to the environment have changed for you and your families over the last 3 generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Siad. I really appreciated how you tied academic rigor or research together with stories in such poetic and thought-provoking ways. You've taken us, or we have taken us through from Lebanon, from where you came from previously, to this lecture to Australia, and then into further conversations. So I'm now calling us back to Schleining and to this series, and also look a little bit at the future, because next week will actually be the last lecture of this year, and we'll speak with Dr. Heikki Patamäki about planetary belonging, the enigma of small local differences within humanity. So as the part of the last lecture, he will really round up this series and maybe put a a last little frame or a circle around the topics and conversations we have covered or touched upon. And it would be an absolute pleasure to see some of you here and welcome you again next year then. Thanks for your time and for your interest and engagement.